Adolf Hitler was definitely a cult leader. They weren't saying Heil Germany, they were saying Heil Hitler. The leader of North Korea, Kim, is a cult leader. If Scientology had said to Tom Cruise in the very beginning what they fully believe, I think he would have said, God, you guys have got a screw loose.
Have you seen any overlap recently in affiliation with political parties and cult-like behavior?
Well,
This episode is sponsored by NordVPN. If you followed the show for a while, then you've probably heard me complain about how bad Canadian Netflix is. It was bad as a teenager. It was annoying to go to America and see how good Netflix was. If you Americans don't know, it's bad. I mean, Netflix has been bad recently in America too, I suppose, but at least it has variety here. I used NordVPN to watch the best shows on Netflix and online anywhere in the world from Canada. Now that I live in Miami, I don't use NordVPN to watch good Netflix shows. But no matter where I go, I like to safeguard my online activity. NordVPN's state-of-the-art encryption protects you from third parties who want to watch what you're doing online. It also protects you from hackers, malware, and malicious people who might want to track your online activity. With their incredibly fast coverage, some VPNs are so slow. NordVPN's a simple way to guarantee your privacy and keep you safe online. Super easy to start using, and it protects you from anyone knowing what websites you've been visiting. And I think given the political atmosphere right now, it's worth doing. Just in case the government gets weird, who knows? Grab your exclusive NordVPN deal by going to nordvpn.com/TMPP to get a huge discount off your NordVPN plan plus 4 months for free. It's completely risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. So you can go there, see how fast it is, forget you're using a VPN, be protected. Sign up for NordVPN and enjoy this episode. Rick Ross, welcome to my podcast.
thank you. It's nice to be here, Michaela.
Yeah, this should be a fun conversation. I decided to have you on because apparently you're a cult expert. So before we get started, can you give a brief background about what it is you do and who you are?
Okay, I started my work in 1982. I am the founder and executive director of the Cult Education Institute, which is an educational nonprofit with a huge library online about destructive groups called cults and other controversial groups. You can find it at culteducation.com. I also do interventions to help people leave cults. And I've done over 500 across the United States and internationally. And I testify as a court expert witness in cases involving controversial groups, such as groups that have been called cults. I've been qualified and testified in 11 states, including United States federal court.
Wow. Okay. So why did you decide to spend your life doing this, looking into cults and understanding them?
Well, it started, Michaela, as a personal thing. A weird group infiltrated a nursing home where my grandmother lived, and they were targeting the elderly.
Ooh.
And quite frankly, it kind of pissed me off. And so I wanted to protect my grandmother. I wanted to protect the other people there. And then I guess I became an anti-cult activist / community organizer. And then I was on one committee after another committee. And then I worked for a social service agency and then started doing interventions privately in the 80s. And so it grew out of a personal interest because it affected my family. And I could see that it was a negative thing. And as I continued, I realized how dark and very negative the world of destructive cults is, and just how terrible it can be. For example, Keith Raniere, the leader of this group called NXIVM, that I exposed very early on in around 2001, 2002. Raniere is now serving 120 years in prison for tax fraud, for sex trafficking, for racketeering.
Wow.
He is the man that created this kind of sex cult where women were actually physically branded with his initials, with a cauterized.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, there were many women that were tortured in this way. And so I helped Catherine Oxenberg, an actress whose daughter, India Oxenberg, was in the group. And then I also helped many families, and I helped many people to leave NXIVM. Keith Raniere sued me for 14 years because I published these papers by two doctors, a psychiatrist and a clinical psychologist, that were analyzing what was wrong with these training seminars that were under the umbrella of NXIVM, that they were causing people to have meltdowns, be hospitalized, and the doctors explained why. And when I published those papers online at culteducation.com, Keith Raniere sued me, and that lawsuit went on for 14 years and was dismissed shortly before his arrest. I also wrote the book Cults Inside Out, which is the first book about cults to include Keith Raniere and NXIVM.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Well, I have a bunch of questions. I think let's start at the beginning here. What's the difference between a cult and a religion?
Well, a religion does not have typically an absolute totalitarian leader that becomes the defining element and driving force of the group. And that leader really becomes an object of worship. So what you have typically is a founder who has absolute power. There are no checks and balances. Whatever he says is right is right. Whatever he says is wrong is wrong. And then the leader uses identifiable thought reform and influence techniques to coercively, break people down, change the way they think, and then lock them in a kind of group environment that the leader controls. And then finally, if it's going to be called a destructive cult, you would look to see how is the group hurting people. Because if the group is perhaps a benign cult and they don't hurt anyone, they have a leader, they have a mindset, but they're not really hurting anyone, then really it's not something that would draw my attention. So what I'm looking for is, are they hurting people? And that varies by degree from group to group. NXIVM, Keith Raniere, would be a very extreme example of destructive behavior. But there are many groups that they just want your money, they want free labor, and then it can escalate to sexual exploitation and abuse, physical abuse, and criminality. For example, the cult Aum Shinrikyo in Japan, where the leader Shoko Asahara in 1995 ordered his people to release poison sarin gas in the Tokyo subway system. Thousands of people were hospitalized. Many people died because of what he did. And so he ended up being executed. Other members of the group were in prison. And this is an example of probably on a 1 to 10, 1 being, a cranky but least destructive cult, and then 10 being the worst. I think Asahara would be a 10.
Wow. Okay. So you've kind of been in a battle when did you start doing this?
40 years ago.
Wow.
So I've been doing my work for 40 years.
Sounds like a somewhat stressful way to live.
Yeah, I've been under the protection of the Justice Department, Homeland Security, and the FBI because of threats on my life. Keith Raniere, who I mentioned, had me under surveillance, penetrated my private banking records and phone records, and, just harassed me for more than a decade. And there have been other groups that also have sued me and harassed me and stalked me and threatened my life over the years. When I testified against Raniere in federal court, I was under the protection of the Homeland Security Department. So it can be dangerous, it can be stressful, but I think I can't think of anything that I've done in my life that is equally rewarding as seeing people who have been victimized by cults freed and seeing just horrible, I would say evil cult leaders put away. And Keith Raniere is now in a lockdown, kind of isolated protective custody place where sex criminals go. And he raped children. He raped a 12-year-old. He raped a 14-year-old. And so recently, another sex offender who didn't rape children punched him out, beat him up, and he complained about it. But even in prison, there's a kind of code, and somebody who rapes children, they're at the very bottom. And that's where Keith Raniere is now. And I'm happy to say I helped to put him there.
Have you seen an overlap in personality between all these cult leaders?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember one time talking to the psychologist and cult expert Margaret Singer, who really was probably the leading cult expert of the 20th century. And I asked her, I had dealt with a cult leader by the name of David Koresh, who was the leader of a group called the Waco Davidians. And I had helped people leave the Davidians, helped a number of families. I was working with the BATF and the FBI and doing analysis for CBS News. And someone said that they could deprogram David Koresh. And I said, how can you deprogram him? He's not programmed in the first place. He's a psychopath.
Mhm.
And that person said to me, well, I don't think he's a psychopath. And so I asked Margaret Singer, what do you think? And she said, Rick, they're all psychopaths. And I think the basic threshold requirements to be a cult leader is, number one, be at least a sociopath with no sense of right or wrong, no conscience. You don't care who you hurt. What a cult leader cares about is what's in it for me, what's good for me is good, and what's bad for me is bad. And they have no innate kind of morals or ethics or anything like that. And then typically they're just intensely narcissistic. I would describe them as malignant narcissists, very extreme. They have little, if any, empathy. They seem to only have sympathy for themselves, and they're very pathological in their pattern of lying and misrepresenting themselves. So I've met a number of cult leaders over the years. You know, I've testified against them in court. I've met them face to face. And for example, Keith Raniere. And to me, they're all the same. They're almost all the same. And I feel like I'm meeting the same person with a different skin suit over and over again.
Ooh,
I mean, because
creepy.
they behave the same.
So these aren't people that maybe start thinking that they want to change the world for the better. You think these are just bad people to begin with, or do they have this grandiose idea that they're going to improve things and it just devolves into chaos?
I think it's possible for
Okay.
them to have good intentions, though it's been argued that they usually are born pretty much bad. Some of them seem to be hardwired that way. Raniere was harassing little girls when he was 10, and he was
Wow.
recognized as a predator. Charlie Manson, you know, the Manson family, the Tate LaBianca murders in 1970, 1969, that family was active. And, you know, Manson was definitely a psychopath, but you could argue that because of his very unhappy childhood and the fact that he was raised basically within juvenile facilities and prisons, that he was influenced to be bad. But they're, in my opinion, they're very often innately bad. There was a leader, Charles Diedrich, who started an intentional community for drug rehabilitation called Synanon, which was very popular in California. Synanon would be going back to the 80s. And eventually Diedrich would be prosecuted for criminal offenses and the group would be taken down. But I think originally it seemed like there were good intentions. That is, to get people off drugs, to get them to
Yeah.
live a sober, clean life. But it just went off the rails because, in my experience, when you don't have checks and balances and transparency in the hierarchical structure of a group, absolute power corrupts. I mean, people become corrupted by not having anyone to answer to. And I think Diedrich got worse and worse until he was arrested. And I think that many cult leaders seem to have started out not so bad, and the situation escalates. Jim Jones would be another example. Jim Jones was very popular within Democratic Party circles. He was very good friends with Governor Jerry Brown, State Assemblyman Willie Brown. When Rosalind Carter visited San Francisco, she did a photo op with Jim Jones. He would later be responsible for the murder of 1,000 people, including over 200 children, in what was called the Jonestown murder-suicide. But at one time, he was the head of a very big church in the Bay Area, and they had a branch in LA. And there were thousands and thousands of people that thought he was fantastic. He was a liberal mover and shaker who basically created programs to feed the elderly, drug rehabilitation. The church was very multiracial, multicultural, and he was seen as kind of an icon of change in the 70s. But in 1978, he ended up with 1,000 of his diehard followers in English-speaking Guyana. And after he murdered a United States congressman that came to investigate what was going on in that community, which was isolated in the jungle, where Jim Jones controlled everything, he reckoned that the authorities were coming for him. They were. And so they mixed what was referred to as Kool-Aid with poison, cyanide, and phenobarbital and sleeping, pills. And the end result was 1,000 people dead, and Jim Jones as well. And that's where we get the phrase, "Oh, you drank the Kool-Aid." That's an allusion to Jonestown. Though the Kool-Aid company wants us to know it really wasn't Kool-Aid. It was Flavor Aid. It wasn't their Kool-Aid. It was a different one. But that was a big shocker for everybody in 78, I think. And people said, who are these cults? What are they doing? 1,000 people are dead. 200 children, their bodies are being moved out of Guyana. What is this? How could they be there? Where did they come from? They're Americans. What are they doing in a compound in the middle of the jungle? And so that was the beginning of cult awareness. And in my book, Cults Inside Out, I really get into that history, and I show the evolving of cults beginning in the 70s to today.
Is this something that was like, were cults very, I guess, not popular, but were there more cults in the 70s than there are now? Is this something that was more frequent back then, or did people just find out about them then?
Michaela, it's a growth industry. Okay. Now
Okay.
we have social media, and we have PayPal, and we have ways that people can be recruited online and then extracted money from them and so on. There are all kinds of cults that proliferate online. I'll give you just one example. There's a group called Carbon Nation, and this is led by an African American by the name of Eligio Bishop. He also went by Nature Boy was at one time his nickname. And so he would recruit on Facebook, on Twitter, on social media, and then he rented an Airbnb online in Costa Rica. And some people would give him money online, and then some people were pulled into the Airbnb, and it became a little cult compound. The Costa Ricans kicked him out. The Panamanians later kicked him out. The Mexicans kicked him out. And he ended up back in Atlanta, where he was from, and he's now in jail, facing charges of sexual abuse and criminal exploitation of people in the group. But the group wasn't that big. There were maybe 30, 40 people in the community at the most. And he could make money and pay for the Airbnb and everything online. And so you have groups that are streaming online, that there are certain leaders that may even have hundreds of thousands of followers online. There's a woman by the name of Teal Swan, who's quite popular. She's been called a cult leader. She would say, I'm just holding forth online. And she has hundreds of thousands of people who follow her online. And these people become very wealthy. And then they extract some people from their online following to become their inner circle or community. Teal Swan has that. Dr. Phil and I, at one point, exposed a woman by the name of Amy Carlson. And she headed a group called Love Has Won. And you may have read about her. She probably had no more than 30 or 40 followers, but at the time of her death, She had $500,000 in cash, about $1 million in real estate paid for, and people were vying for who's going to control the assets of this group. And they couldn't accept Amy Carlson's death. They called her Mother God. So they took the body and they decorated it with glitter and lights.
No.
And they basically worshiped it until the authorities knocked down the door and arrested people for essentially violating a dead body.
Wow. Okay, so I've got a few questions then. What's the average type of person that ends up in a cult? Is there an overlap there?
There is a kind of narrative thread that you could pull through a lot of people, but it could be anybody. They could be any race, any socioeconomic level. They could be rich, they could be poor, they could be young, they could be old, they could be highly educated or uneducated. But what I've seen, if I were going to pull a consistent thread through many of the cases that I've dealt with, it would be somebody who's not happy at a particular point in their life. And they're feeling like, I'm just really unhappy with my life. I'm depressed. And at that point, they have the bad luck that someone they know, could be a family member, friend, coworker, they approach them and say, hey, you want to come to this meeting? You want to go play volleyball with these friends of mine? I mean, it could be very innocuous. It could seem very innocent, because the group is not going to tell you what their agenda is or disclose anything that might put you off. So a lot of it's about deceptive recruitment and just flat out lying. Some of these groups have multiple names. You don't even know who you're being recruited by. You find out later, oh, it's that cult that I read about, but now they're using a new front organizational name that I didn't know about. So many of the people that I work with are just amazing people, really smart. For example, not long ago, I was working with a young woman who had recently graduated with honors from Harvard University. I also work with a young man who was attending Penn, the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, on full scholarship, graduated from his class as a valedictorian, went on to MIT, and is now a civil engineer. But at one point, he was lured into a cult on the campus of Penn. A lot of these groups do recruit on college campuses because I'd say their main target group is 18 to 26. But 5 of the people that I have worked with are medical doctors. I helped to deprogram and bring out of a cult an orthopedic surgeon, an anesthesiologist, a gastrointestinal specialist. These people were not dumb. They weren't illiterate. They were sophisticated, well-educated people. So I think if we think that we're not vulnerable, we're not really being honest with ourselves. Anyone can be had given the right set of circumstances and timing. And that's why I think it's so important to be aware that these groups exist, so that you know what to look for and you can be prepared. And if the group approaches you, you can say, hey, you know what? You seem kind of weird. You seem like some kind of cult group. And you do your due diligence and you drill down and find out more, and you realize, hey, this is a cult.
Okay, so I guess we could start with how do people identify when it's a cult? What are the signs?
Well, you go to the meeting and you see a big portrait of the leader on the wall. That's a real red flag. And everybody is talking over and over again about how great the leader is, and the leader says this and the leader says that. And you realize that the leader is what it's all about, and that they worship the leader, and that the leader is the core defining element of the group. And then you realize that everyone only views the leader through a positive lens. They're not critical. No one ever disagrees with the leader. And you also realize that there's no accountability in the organization. For example, a democratically elected board, financial transparency through published budgets distributed to all contributors, things like that. You know, you go to GuideStar, you know, or another website online, and you find out, boy, this is kind of shady. They're not really showing me where the money goes. And you feel like there's no legitimate reason to leave, and that anybody who leaves is characterized in a negative light. And you also recognize that people are becoming isolated, socially isolated, and they're kind of cocooning in this group, and they're not really in touch with maybe their family, their old friends, things like that. And when you begin to see these warning signs over and over again, you begin to put together a picture of a very authoritarian group. Everything is black and white, nothing in shades of gray, and people are just agreeing constantly with whatever is said. And you might be there thinking, God, they just said something that's really weird. Why is everybody like nodding their head? What is this, a bunch of head bobbers or what? I mean, is anybody thinking here? And so the group kind of creates an environment where everything the leader says is reinforced and nothing is ever questioned.
Okay, that sounds pretty stereotypical, but that sounds good. You spoke a bit about thought reform and influence techniques. Could you describe what kind of influence techniques cult leaders use?
I write about this in a chapter in my book called Cult Brainwashing. And probably the seminal book on influence techniques is the book Influence by the professor from ASU, Robert Cialdini. And I'll give you a few of them. One would be liking. We're more apt to go along with somebody that we like than somebody we don't like, which is the key to celebrity endorsements. I'm going to buy that car because that athlete or that celebrity is pitching it. So that's why they have celebrities do that, is because if you like that celebrity, it will influence you to buy the product. So in a cult, you experience what's called like love bombing, which means you get into the group, and this is another warning sign, and everybody's just loving on you. They're all just going, oh wow, it's so great to meet you. Oh wow, we were, they're just saying a lot of effusive, praising things, and it's because they want you to like them, and they want you to feel kind of reluctant to not embrace them because they are so nice. So the principle is liking. Another one would be social proof, which is a big one. So you look around you to see what other people are doing, and then you determine what you're going to do. When you're at the airport, going into lines, going through TSA or whatever, you're looking, are they taking off their shoes or what? I mean, do I need to take off my shoes? So that is what we call social proof. So if a group can cocoon you in a what I would call a false social proof, where everything is really controlled, and you're getting this feedback that everything is normal, even though it's not, you feel that your doubts, your misgivings are misplaced. And so you kind of go, well, nobody else is acting like this is bad, so I'll act like it's okay as well. So social proof would be another one. And another one would be authority. So you are more likely to be compliant with someone who represents authority than someone who doesn't. So if a uniformed police officer approaches you and says, I want to talk to you about the situation here, you're going to be more attentive than it's some guy in cutoffs and a t-shirt. So if the group projects authority, and they may do that by, for example, invoking God, invoking the Bible, saying everything I say to you is in this book, the Bible, when in reality, they're very likely twisting scriptures out of context for their own purposes. But if they can invoke the authority of the Bible, that's a big one in the US and Western Europe. So you say, I'm not speaking for myself, but Jesus said, the Bible says, Moses said. So then you're kind of thinking, well, I have to go along with this because of the authority of Scripture, because of who they are quoting, and so on. And that can be manipulated in many different ways.
So before I jumped on the podcast, I was doing a bit of reading and I looked up the most popular cults in America right now. And it looked like a huge percentage of them, like maybe 80%, had something to do with like somebody's version of the Bible, which shocked me that a lot of them were considered cults. So that was interesting. I didn't know that. Are cults more prevalent in America, or is this something that really occurs worldwide?
It occurs worldwide. My book was translated into Chinese and Italian, and I've lectured abroad as well as across the U.S. And really, in the U.S., though, because of the First Amendment, separation of church and state, and because of the relative ease in which a group can say, look, we're a religious group, give us 501c3 nonprofit religious status, which really gives them kind of almost a license to steal at times, because they don't have to pay taxes, they don't pay property taxes, and religious organizations in our history in the U.S. are given more protection than, let's say, another nonprofit, like an educational nonprofit. So the religious cult or some type of spiritually based cult will say, well, look, we're a religion, and if you criticize anything our leader does, if you criticize what we're doing, even if it's former members that are saying they were ripped off or they were hurt, they were exploited, that's persecution. So you better be careful, because we're protected by the First Amendment. So I think a lot of groups come from overseas, quite a few, and they set up shop or they set up a branch in the U.S. because this is where they like to have their money. This is where they might make some investments because of the protection that our country affords people through the First Amendment separation of church and state.
Do you know what the cult that's around currently that has the most members is? Or in the past, the largest cult?
I would say one of the largest groups that was called a cult would be a group called the International Church of Christ, which was founded by a guy by the name of Kip McKean. In fact, Kip is still out there doing his thing, but the group has fallen on kind of hard times. But at their peak, they went from 12 members in 1978 to about, I would say, about 250,000 by 1998. And then a number of scandals occurred, and Kip McKean kind of fell from grace. It was a Bible-based group, and it was a break-off from the independent churches of Christ. Though the first people to blow the whistle on Kip McKean was, in fact, the independent churches of Christ. They said, this guy is not good. He used to kind of be with us, and he broke away, and they were very critical of him. And he is still out there. I mean, he's like, now, what is Kip? He must be in his 70s, and he's still preaching. He's probably down to, maybe he's just got maybe 5,000 or less actual followers at this point. And of course, people often think that Scientology, which has been called a cult, is really big. And the Scientologists will always say, oh, we have millions. Probably, based on what I know, they probably have less than 50,000 members globally. And that they've been kind of losing members over a period of time. The founder, L. Ron Hubbard, died in 1986, and his successor was his former secretary, a man by the name of David Miscavige, who's best buddies with Tom Cruise. In fact, he was Tom Cruise's best man when Tom Cruise married Katie Holmes. I don't think he was at the divorce settlement, though. But anyway, David Miscavige is now the absolute leader of Scientology. And what I think is significant about Scientology is how much money they have. Between their real estate and their cash, it's been estimated that Scientology is now worth more than $3 billion. And it's been said by some inner circle people that left that they have $1 billion just in cash. And so if
Wow.
you go to Clearwater, Florida, they own a chunk of downtown. If you go to Hollywood in Los Angeles, you're going to see a lot of buildings controlled by Scientology. So their real estate portfolio is awesome. I mean, it's very, very full of these properties that they don't pay taxes on, by and large, because they
Hmm.
get religious nonprofit status.
Is the government after these people like mad?
No, I think it boils down to you if they're doing weird things, if they're
Yeah.
indoctrinating people and people are believing in science fiction stories or whatever, which is the case with Scientology, it's just an issue of criminality, so for example, Danny Masterson, from that 70s show, he's facing rape charges. And the allegations are that he took advantage of Scientologists, women, and that because they were all in Scientology, they were essentially kept from speaking out. They were, they were dealt with internally by Scientology, and that Danny Masterson got away with things because he was, a Scientology celebrity. And now Masterson is facing trial in the coming months for what he did. So
Wow.
if a group doesn't do something criminal, if they don't actually break the law, then the authorities are not going to go after them. So it could be tax fraud, it could be money laundering, it could be sex trafficking, it could be racketeering in some way, or it could be something like, for example, violation of copyright. There
Hmm.
was one leader, his name was Keith Ham, and he built a huge temple in Virginia. And it was like the Krishna temple, the Hare Krishnas. And Ham also liked to sell counterfeit Disney paraphernalia. And one of the things that he was busted on was counterfeiting goods. Later, he also was involved in a murder conspiracy because there were people that were leaving the Hare Krishna movement that were very critical of this guy, and he wanted them taken out. And so there were
Wow.
people that were killed. So if the cult doesn't do anything illegal, if all they do is believe in weird stuff, and that you can't really, you can't prosecute them for that. And sadly, if they break up marriages, they break up families, they isolate people, they compromise their education, their career, none of that is criminal. I mean,
Yeah.
because the cult will just say, well, this is what we all shared this, and this person made this choice on their own. But I would argue that they were under undue influence, and that's why they made choices that were not in their best interest.
What does cult deprogramming look like?
Oh, it looks like a surprise to start off,
Yeah.
because you don't like send somebody an invitation and say, gee, would you please attend this deprogramming, because they're going to immediately text their leader, their associates in the group, or they're going to email them or call them, and they're going to say, what should I do? And they're going to tell them, no way. So
Hmm.
first of all, it's like a drug or alcohol intervention. It's a total surprise. And so the person, typically they're with their family for a visit, they're on vacation, and the family may come to their home. It could be the adult children having an intervention for their parents. It could be the parents, more typically, doing an intervention regarding an adult child. Or it could be a spouse. So you start off, it's a surprise. The person who is the focus of the intervention is probably kind of pissed. And they're
Yeah.
saying, why are you doing this? You like blindsided me. So you have to kind of work through that and say, look, we're here because your family's very worried about you. They're concerned about you. And then you begin this discussion with the family or the loved ones present. And you're talking really about four things during the intervention. Number one, defining what is a destructive cult or a destructive authoritarian group. What are its core elements? Does it match up with the group you're involved in? Number two, what is coercive persuasion? What are these influence techniques that you think have been used to gain undue influence over me? And then you discuss all of the particulars, the criteria of what constitutes coercive persuasion or thought reform. And then third, why is my family worried about me? And so the family is going to say, well, you're not taking your insulin because you think the group can cure your diabetes. I've been involved in 3 interventions like that where people almost died because they believed that the group had a cure for diabetes, which they did not. And they were in and out of the hospital trying the cure. So that would be one concern of the family, their physical well-being, their health, or it could be their financial well-being, that they're giving everything to the group, or that they're not paying attention to their children, that they're neglecting their family, that they're becoming increasingly isolated, and so forth. So the family is now saying, this is why we're here. This is why we brought this guy, Rick, to come and sit with us and talk about this stuff. And then the next thing would be, what is it that the group is hiding from you? Is the group hiding anything from you? Do you know everything about this group? So then comes out the research. Did you know that the leader was arrested for spousal abuse? Did you know the leader has a secret getaway that $1 million was the price tag? Did you know that the leader is basically enriching himself and his family from the money from the group, which is supposed to be a charitable nonprofit? You want to bring out all that, and then the person ultimately is going to make their own choice. The intervention might take 3 days. So you're going to agree to meet again the next day. You might talk for 5, 6, 8 hours a day with the family and the person that's involved. And then ultimately, though, it's up to them. Do they want to leave the group? Do they want to take a break? Do they just want to say, forget it, I'm going back? About 7 out of 10 people that I sit down with will decide to take a break or leave the group at the end. But about 30% will say, I'm leaving in the first day because I don't like what you're talking about. I don't like it. And that is their choice.
So you basically go in there and try and untangle people from a narrative. You're like, well, does this narrative make more sense? And then they have to think about it if they're willing to.
I think what you're doing is you are explaining to them how they got to where they're at, that they've become basically a pawn for the group in most situations. And they have subordinated their value judgments, their thinking to the leaders in the group. So to the extent that it's negatively impacting their life. So what you want to do is rewind the entire recruitment process, the indoctrination process, and say, how did you get from where you were an independent functioning person, to where you are now, where you're so dependent upon the group and the leader to make decisions for you? I mean, for example, give me an example of something that you disagree with the group about. I mean, typically people can say, oh, I don't like this about my church, or I don't like this about the club that I'm in, or the fraternity or sorority that I'm in. I think that person's a jerk. This is kind of ridiculous that they do, and I'm not up for that. But cult members are more like locked in, and they can't think of anything significant that they disagree with the group about. So you want to ask them, how did you get here? Let's look at the recruitment process that brought you through. Let's look at the indoctrination process that nailed you down. And were you tricked and kind of trapped in this group? Or do you think that the group was fully transparent and honest with you? So what you're really doing is rewinding that process so that they can slow motion it and freeze it at different points and examine it and then decide, is this what I really signed up for? I mean, is it? in my experience, most people that are in cults, if they knew what they were getting involved in from the beginning,
Mhm.
they would not have gotten involved. I mean, if Scientology had said to Tom Cruise in the very beginning what they fully believed, regarding their origins, which is a science fiction story written by L. Ron Hubbard about a galactic overlord named Xenu who sent overpopulated beings to this planet, and then they were killed, and their spirits are still residing in our environment, and they attach themselves to you, and they would say, Michaela, you have body thetans on you, and the only technology that can get those BTs off is Scientology. If they had told that to Tom Cruise from day one, when Mimi Rogers, his girlfriend, then wife, kind of brought him into Scientology, I think he would have said, God, you guys have got a screw loose. I'm not interested in that sci-fi stuff. But they came to him and they said, look, you've got dyslexia. We have study technology. We're a self-improvement organization. We're here to help you realize your potential. And they painted a different picture. Now he's pushing 60. He's 3 for 3, 3 marriages, 3 divorces. And I would argue that every one of them was a direct result of Scientology. Mimi Rogers, her parents left. She was raised in Scientology, and she wanted to continue with them because Scientologists routinely disconnect or cut off a family member who leaves Scientology. They're labeled what Scientology calls a suppressive person, an SP. And so Mimi Rogers, I think, though she's never really talked publicly about this in any depth, that she wanted to continue to be part of her family and her parents. And so she left Scientology. And that made her an SP, or at a bare minimum, what Scientology would call potential trouble source, a PTS. So Tom Cruise divorces her. He marries Nicole Kidman. Nicole Kidman, for a while, I think he really loved her, and she really loved him. And she tried to kind of wean him off of Scientology, and it backfired. And Scientology sent in one of their enforcers, a guy named Marty Rathbun, who basically broke up that marriage. Wow. And it was about Scientology. And then Katie Holmes, I think, really loved Tom Cruise, and I think he really loved her. I believe him when he was jumping on the couch and saying at Oprah's show and saying, I love this woman. I think he really did. And they had a beautiful child that he hasn't seen for years, his daughter, Sarita. Oh. And why? Because Katie Holmes, I would say, did not want to have her daughter raised in Scientology, and she did not want to be in Scientology. So here's this guy that's gone through decades with Scientology, 3 divorces. He's a really smart guy. I mean, look at his career, amazing career. So how do you figure it? I figure it that he was, in my opinion, tricked and trapped in Scientology, and that he can't imagine a life outside of Scientology. Though now he doesn't talk about it very much, because he doesn't want to put a negative, element in his rollout of his movie projects. And I think that's smart. But he's really been damaged, I think, in my opinion, by Scientology.
Yeah, I'd say so. His credibility, for sure. Have you dealt with a lot of people who were trapped in cults? So when you did an intervention, they said, okay, you're right, but I can't leave because, I don't know, they're blackmailing me or something like that?
I dealt with a really sad situation once with a man who had left the mainstream Mormon church, and he had become a member of a polygamist cult, the one that we all have heard about, the FLDS, led by Warren Jeffs, who's now in prison for molesting and raping children. So this man became involved. He was deeply involved. He had 4 wives. by the time I met him, but he was becoming very disillusioned, as many of the people in the FLDS have become, and many have left. This cult at one time controlled the towns of Hilldale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona. The police force, city government, schools, everything. It was like a cult town. And so this man became disillusioned, but he has all these children. He has 4 wives. I met with him. I talked with him because his sister, who was a mainstream Mormon, felt sorry for him. He was visiting with her and he was very sad. And she said, why don't you talk to this guy who knows about groups like this? And maybe you can see a way to resolve this. And I would love for you to leave and come back into the fold with our family, which you've been isolated from for years. And at the end, you could see that there was just no way, because he had all these wives, all these kids. I don't know how many kids he had, probably 15, 20. And it's a family unit that he built over a period of decades. And he could not see walking away from that. And that keeps a lot of cult members anchored. And I write about that in my book. I would call it exit costs. What are the exit costs of leaving the group? Are you going to lose your job? Are you going to lose your family? Are you going to feel that after years of devotion that you have nowhere really to go with your life, that maybe you're too old? You've been in a group for a really long time. I once worked with a man who joined Scientology when he was 22, and he left when he was almost 50. And the family did an intervention. He had been in Scientology for 27 years, from the age of 22 to 49. And I write about him in my book. And he had a terrible time coming out of Scientology. He did. And the way that I think he could do that was because his wife wasn't really that involved. And he loved her, and they'd been married many years. He had 2 adult children going to college, and they weren't really involved. So he had a family to be with that loved him. But all of his friends were Scientologists, every single one of them practically. And for him to leave that kind of subculture and start over again, it was tough. But he did. He managed to do it. But that is one of the reasons that people stay. They just can't imagine a life after decades of being in a group. And some people will leave a group called a cult very relatively soon, like in the first year to 5 years. But there are many people who stay for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. For example, Allison Mack, the actress that was in Smallville, that series about Superman growing up. She had a great career. She was very well liked by many people in the entertainment industry. And she ended up with Keith Raniere and NXIVM for, I guess, 20 years, pretty much. And by the time it was over, she had lost most of her money, her career, her reputation. And as we speak, she's in prison. She's going to be serving out a 3.5-year prison term. And she sacrificed it all. And very, very sad that happened to her. But she was involved in this torturing of women. She was directly and physically involved. And so they had to send her to prison. But I think if she were talking to you right now, she'd probably say she has some serious regrets about how long she stayed in NXIVM.
Is NXIVM the most brutal cult that you've studied?
No, I think the Waco Davidians, that was a pretty brutal group. I mean, David Koresh raped children. Some of them bore him children when they were children. The one girl I met, he raped when she was 10. The group was heavily armed. They were militaristic. They were violent. I think that was a really bad group. I think that Aum Shinrikyo, Shoko Asahara, who had members of his group that were physicists that were working on weapons of mass destruction. They were
Oof.
testing the poison gas on the Tokyo subway system as a prelude. They were also hoping to build a nuclear device. I think Shoko Asahara and Aum Shinrikyo were a terrible group. And there have been various groups like Jim Jones, Jonestown, the 1,000 people that died there, definitely worse than NXIVM. There was a group in Africa, Movement for the Restoration of the Ten Commandments, led by a man by the name of Joseph Kibwetere. And that group, Kibwetere, predicted the end of the world in the year 2000. And when it didn't happen and people were starting to want to leave and rejoin their families, this was going on in Uganda, Kibwetere just started killing them. By the time he was done, there were 750 bodies recovered. That was a really bad group. And I don't know if you remember Heaven's Gate. That was a small group led by a man named Marshall Applewhite. 39 people were found dead, including Applewhite, in a mansion they leased between Los Angeles and San Diego in the general area of La Jolla. That was in 1995. And then there was also a group in Europe called the Solar Temple. And that group ended in mass murder suicide. About 80, 90 people died, along with their leader, Luc Jouret, who was from Canada. And they ended up in chalets in Switzerland and France, where they died in deliberately set fires. So there have been just many, many groups like this. And I would want to point out also groups that do not believe in medical care. There are a number of groups in the United States, for example, General Assembly Church of the Firstborn, and Christ followers, followers of Christ, that do not believe in any kind of medical care. So members in those groups routinely die, many of them children, and only recently have the courts begun to strike down religious exemptions for parents who don't want to take their children to a doctor. So a number of them have been prosecuted, they've been sentenced to prison, and children have been saved by court order, but many children have died. There was one group, Faith Assembly, led by Hobart Freeman in Indiana, where there just were so many children that died in that group because they could have been taken to a doctor, and about 80% of them could have survived. I mean, only a small percentage were incurable. It could be something as simple as the use of antibiotics. So children died, they died in pain from these faith healing groups, is what they're often called. And of course, there are quite a few of them in the United States. And then, of course, we have the polygamous communities and the abuse of children in those communities. There are about 50,000 people in North America that are involved in polygamist groups.
This is wild. I think the cults that I'd heard of Jonestown, right? That's what that was called. I'd heard of that, and Scientology, of course. What about the Moonies? Can you describe who they were, and are they still around?
They are still around. Reverend Moon started back in the 50s, the 60s, and he created what was called the Unification Church. And he built it originally in South Korea, and then he started building branches in Japan, in North America. And they were known as the Moonies because they worshiped Reverend Moon as the Messiah. Reverend Moon would teach them that he alone would redeem the world, and that basically Jesus had flunked, and that he was going to fulfill what needed to be done. And they would recruit young people on college campuses, and then they would persuade them to go to these retreats, these camps that were scattered around the United States, where they would be intensely indoctrinated and isolated for periods of weeks. Many people would call this being brainwashed. And then the Moonies would go on the streets. This happened in the 70s and the 80s, and they would just be oftentimes deceptively shilling for donations. They would give different names. They would not identify themselves correctly, and they even fake being disabled to get money. And so Reverend Moon at one point had thousands of people in the United States hitting the streets daily, shilling for him. And the average Moonie would make about $200 a day, and they'd bring it back to Reverend Moon. On that basis, he built a financial empire that is now valued at over $1 billion. Reverend Moon died at the age of, I think, 92 a few years back. His family now runs the group. At one point, they owned 1/3 of the American fishing fleet, and they were accountable for, I think, as much as 50% at one point of the wholesale sushi market. So in big cities like New York and Chicago, the Unification Church would pretty much control the sushi business. And Reverend Moon created a real estate empire. The family still controls the New Yorker Hotel in Manhattan, and they bought land in South America, their mansions. I mean, it was a very successful group. And most recently, when you read in the news about the Prime Minister of Japan, Abe, who they just buried him in a state funeral. He was the Prime Minister of Japan. He was assassinated by a young man, 41 years old, who was unhappy with Abe because of his connection to Reverend Moon and the Unification Church.
What?
The young man's mother in Japan was bilked out of $750,000, and it decimated the family, bankrupted them. And the young man suffered, his family suffered. And he blamed Abe because Abe was influenced by the Unification Church. He would, go along with things, help them in different ways. He would be a speaker at some of their activities. And so the man made a gun and shot the former Prime Minister of Japan, who was recently buried. And it really caused all the Japanese to come forward that were hurt by the Unification Church, many of them. And they would say, yes, this happened to me. And different cult experts in Japan would also come forward and say, yeah, this is really a problem. And the group is still very much alive and well in Japan. And they have quite a following in the US.
Wow. Okay. I didn't realize they were still around. What's your view on QAnon? Is that a cult?
I think of it as a cult, but it's a very unusual cult. The leader is anonymous. So who is Q? Is Q an individual? Is Q a collective? We don't know. I don't think Q is actually a high-ranking person in the established, intelligence community as portrayed. And then there are factions within the QAnon movement that are classic cults. There's one woman, she calls herself the Queen of Canada, and she leads a faction of QAnon people, and she's an object of worship. And there was another man with a group of followers not long ago in Dallas, Texas, who also is a charismatic leader of a faction. And they were waiting for JFK to make himself, JFK Jr., I think, to make himself known in Dallas. And of course, nothing happened. But in a sense, the QAnon group is classic because they're kind of cocooned online, and they're very kind of socially isolated. And no matter how many times Q's predictions fail, they just hang in there. And that's what's called cognitive dissonance in destructive cults. That is, if you believe something, like I believe what Q told me, and then it doesn't happen, and then the group spins it. They say, well, it didn't happen because of this, that, and the other. And then you, being cocooned online, and all of your social interactions are with other QAnon people to a large extent. Whatever the spin is, it's reinforced by the group. And so you then reconcile the conflict between what you have been told to believe and what actually occurs. And that's a very eerie kind of cult-like feature of QAnon, is that there's kind of an alternate reality going on with those folks. And no matter how many times there are these failed predictions, they just keep hanging in there.
Do cults always take money? Like if you have a relative that you and they join something and you're like, is that person in a cult? It's kind of getting culty vibes over there. Can you identify it by the cults asking for money, or are there cults that ask for something else?
Well, they typically want something. I mean, because the leaders that I've dealt with are not very anti-materialistic kind of folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They want a nice car, they want this, they want that, and they feel they're entitled, and they want all the members to help them. So it could be labor that the leader makes money off of. Like I've seen groups that have lawn services, maid services, and then the leader provides cheap housing, no health insurance, very little money, and the leader then bills it out by the hour for these services and makes a very substantial profit. So it could be free labor. It could be just cash. I've seen leaders that have cheated people out of real estate. One intervention I did with a so-called psychic group led by this psychic woman. She was working with a doctor who, by the time the children of the doctor brought me in, she had given $650,000 that they knew of by bank records to the leader. So typically, yeah, they're out to get something. They're out to enrich themselves. And of course, there's a cult-like aspect, I think, to multi-level marketing. So that's when you sign up for something like Amway or Herbalife or LuLaRoe or whatever. And you probably are not going to make much money. And you're probably maybe likely going to lose money. And yet you see this group of people that are like a community, and they're all, we're gonna, the product, and really it's kind of a process of indoctrination to believe in the dream that the group proposes will be your life. You're going to be rich like this distributor. Oh, look at her. She's more money than God, we just bought her a pink Cadillac. So the group really is not so much selling a product as they're recruiting distributors who then buy the product and then also pay up in a multi-level scheme. And there's a very small group of people at the top that actually make a lot of money. And so how do you get people to do that? I would propose that, in my opinion, you gain undue influence over them by isolating them socially within your community, and you just hit them with this false social proof and all of this liking and authority and whatever. And the end result is they become deployable. They become your pawn, and they lose money, and that's how the people at the top make money. And I think that many people in multi-level marketing seem like they've been had, they've been conned, and that the real currency of the multi-level marketing scheme is, how do I gain undue influence over these people so I can exploit them? So they have training seminars, community gatherings, all kinds of things. They're online, they're getting together online, and they're following each other on Facebook, on Twitter, on TikTok, and they're streaming. I mean, this is what's going on with multi-level marketing right now. And so I think people get caught up in it, and that the currency of multi-level marketing, in my opinion, is the technology of being able to break people down and change the way they think so that you can take advantage of them.
I wonder if it also gives people a community, like lonely people, right? People who are already isolated, and then they think, oh, there's this group and they're my friends. I'll help them out. And then even if there's a part of you that knows you're being taken advantage of, well, you have this group of people and they look like they care for you, right? I assume they get a lot of isolated people involved in those kind of schemes. It's sad.
That would be a vulnerability. I mean, someone who really never fit in, who is looking for a community acceptance. Maybe they have family issues where they don't feel loved. And then these people love them, or so they think. What I often tell people is ask yourself this. If you said, I don't want anything to do with this scheme, this group, this leader, would they still love you? And if they won't, is that what kind of love is that? I think that's highly conditional love. Is that what you really want? Because that's kind of fake. Is that what you want? And there are people that will say, I am so lonely, so depressed. Yes, I will take that. I remember one young woman telling me that
Aw.
I don't care about what you've told me. I agree with what you told me. The group is a cult, but it's the first time I've ever felt accepted, the first time I've ever felt loved. And I said, well, yeah, but that's highly conditional. It's predicated on your compliance with the group and obedience to the leader. And she said, I don't care. I want to be with them. They are my family. They are my community. And this was a very socially awkward young woman who had never really had a boyfriend, never really had good friends, and felt always odd person out. And this group, they loved on her big time. And she was willing to take that. So, but usually people will say no. If it's not genuine, if they really don't care about me, then I'm going to leave because I don't need that kind of fake stuff. I'd rather go out and find something real.
Yeah. Have you seen any overlap recently in affiliation with political parties and cult-like behavior?
Well, I'm going to tell you that I think that the word cult is being overly politicized. So you've got people on the left saying, oh, Donald Trump is a cult leader. He is not a cult leader. He is a elected president of the United States who won an election, and he was president. And he then went through a process as president where he was accountable to the courts. He was accountable to the United States Congress, the Senate. They would confirm his appointments. There were checks and balances. And Donald Trump did not brainwash anybody. The people that follow him, that believe in him, they were predisposed to be in agreement with him. And he knew that when he came out and he said, do you care about these issues? And he would tick them off, immigration, China taking advantage of the United States in trade, or maybe you're not a fan of NATO and you feel like our NATO partners aren't paying enough or whatever. There was already an audience for that. There was already a group of people, very large group, about 70 million, that said, we really like what this guy is saying. And he is, he's charismatic. He's a very glib speaker, and he won them over. On the flip side, I don't think you can say that Black Lives Matters or Antifa are cults, because I can identify that absolute authoritarian leader that is the defining element and driving force of those groups. That's an object of worship. So I think it's really important for people on the right and on the left to not vilify and use the word cult as an invective to tear down somebody, because it has very specific meaning. And when I testify as an expert in court, that's always tested. And I have to withstand cross-examination. And so if I use the words destructive cult, I'm going to be very clear about why that group is defined in that way, or destructive authoritarian group. And I don't think that we should politicize the word. And I think it is being thrown around in a way now that is not helpful. And also, I would say it diminishes the genuine suffering of cult victims, because there are people that have been brainwashed, that have been victimized and hurt very badly by destructive cults. And I think when we just glibly say, oh, this guy's a cult leader, the MAGA people are a cult, Bernie Bros are a cult. Bernie Sanders is a cult leader. Not really, not like any cult leader I've dealt with. So I think we should just chill it out there and just kind of dial it down and not get into that, not point fingers and call people a cult leader when they're not.
That was a fantastic response. How often are cult leaders women versus men? Because you've mentioned a number of female cult leaders, and I'm surprised. I think mostly I've heard about male cult leaders.
Well, it's mostly a man's job. It's mostly men, but there have been some very famous cult leaders that were women. Elizabeth Clare Prophet, who led the group Church Universal and Triumphant. She's now dead. But at one point, she bought a ranch in, I think it's in Wyoming, primarily, and perhaps partially in Montana, from Malcolm Forbes, the owner of Forbes magazine. And this was a huge ranch. It was a huge compound. And she was a very formidable leader with thousands of followers and millions of dollars in assets. And at one point, she was predicting the end of the world. I think her prediction was around 1990. And so all these people started moving into the compound, and they actually had underground bunkers for
heard of this.
Yeah, waiting for the end. And it didn't happen. Surprise. And so some of them left, and Elizabeth Clare Prophet eventually died. Then there's a woman in Spindale, North Carolina. Her name is Jane Whaley, and she has presided over a group called Word of Faith Fellowship for many years. And she has been called a cult leader. And then let me think. Well, we talked about Amy Carlson. Then there was a woman by the name of Renee Jewelison. Renee and her husband, but she was the real leader, ran a group called Victory Church in Grand Forks, North Dakota. And I did an Oprah Winfrey show back in 1992, exposing the group and bringing out former members that actually had tape recordings of Renee Jewelison abusing them on the phone. And they were played on Oprah. And that was the beginning of Victory Church, which had hundreds of members, including 3 medical doctors, 2 of whom I worked with personally to get them out of Victory Church. But at one point, it was one of the biggest churches in Grand Forks, North Dakota. And it was a big story because Oprah Winfrey exposed them. In fact, they threatened her with a lawsuit. They said, we're going to sue you, and you can't play those tapes. They're confidential. You can't play them.
Yeah.
And Oprah said, watch me. And she had her lawyers, and she played them on the air. And boy, they were very bad for the leader, Renee Jewelison. She ended up in Orlando, Florida, leading a Bible study in a condominium clubhouse. And then I think she split from her husband, and now they died in obscurity. But at one point, they ruled over a very large church in Grand Forks.
Wow, that's wild. Okay. That's very interesting. It's very interesting how there are people who kind of take off of Christianity, because you said after the cult kind of fell apart, she started leading a Bible study group in Florida. It's interesting how you get people who are reading the Bible and then creating their own churches to take people's money.
Well, to not categorize everything as Christian based, there's a group called Summa Ching Hai, and you can find them online, big group. And it's led by this woman who's originally from Vietnam. She now lives, I think, most of the time in California. And she leads a group of thousands. She would say much more. She has a television show. She has podcasts. She streams. And she's now 70. She's been doing this for years. And she owns the largest chain of vegetarian restaurants, I think, in the world. There are hundreds of them. They're called Loving Hut. And she insists that she is Supreme Master Suma Ching Hai, and that she leads a group that is based kind of on Buddhism and meditation, and they're intensely vegetarian, vegans. And that's a group that really doesn't identify as Christian, led by a woman that is pretty big.
Hmm. There it is. Loving Hut is a chain of vegan restaurants. Wow, that's so weird. Okay, so if you start making friends with people and someone is calling themselves supreme leader, that's a sign.
That would be a giveaway. Oh, my group is just like a regular group. We get together, but the name of our leader is Supreme Master Suma
Yeah.
Ching Hai. Though the members would say, "We have Supreme Master in us all." But
Oh,
but then what I would say is, yeah, but your leader uses it as a title. So why does she use it as a title? And then I will ask members, I recently was involved in an intervention. I'll say, can you think of anyone else that would be the equivalent of Suma Ching Hai as a supreme master? And it's like, no, I can't, because no one is her equal on the planet.
yeah.
And so people buy her jewelry, they buy paintings of her. They typically might have a large painting of her that they paid a lot of money for hanging over their living room couch, and that's a giveaway. When people are that caught up in the leader that they're basically memorializing the leader as an icon in their living room. But most groups are not that obvious.
Then would you have put, just out of curiosity, would you have put somebody like Stalin in the group of cult leader? Now there's a lot of art. There's a lot of Stalin going around.
I would say the leader of North Korea, Kim, is a cult leader. I would regard
Okay.
that as a quasi-religious political cult that was started by his grandfather and then his father and now him. I would say that Adolf Hitler was definitely a cult leader. They weren't saying Heil Germany, they were saying Heil Hitler. And they talked about him as the father of the fatherland, the Fuhrer. I was just watching a movie with Tom Cruise, Valkyrie, in which it follows the attempted assassination of Adolf Hitler by a man by the name of Stauffenberg. And the way that you see the people, worshiping, photos of Hitler, portraits of Hitler, the fear, the palpable fear that they have of him as if he were supernatural. That's a cult. It's not just a political party, it's a cult. And I would say Stalin, yes, I would say so. I would say also that Lenin became a kind of charismatic cult leader. I mean, look, they've got his body embalmed, and people go to Red Square to see his body. And to some extent, Chairman Mao was also could be called a political cult leader. They also have his body enshrined in Tiananmen Square. And then I think we could also, we could look at Ayatollah Khomeini, who at one time was, I think, worshipped in Iran in a way that no other religious leader was his equivalent. I can remember when he died, there were people literally throwing themselves against the coffin as they were going through the funeral service. So I think he became an object of worship. So I think at times a political leader can be a cult leader, but I think we must be very, very careful
Yeah.
about how we use that, because these leaders that I've just described were all dictators with absolute power. They have no and had no accountability, and they were literally an object of worship. And I think if we don't see that kind of extreme expressed in a political group, we shouldn't label it a cult.
I think that's fair. It's the same thing as throwing people into the Nazi category, just casual.
Or comparing everything to the Holocaust. I mean, the
Yeah.
Holocaust was millions of people dying and over 2 million children, many of them infants, that were murdered. So I think when we compare something to the Holocaust, we better choose our words carefully. And when we call somebody a Nazi, which was behind the Holocaust and the apparatus for genocide in Germany and Europe, we need to really think about that, because that's a very harsh label.
Can you let listeners know who are interested in learning more what they should read and where they should go online to find you if you have a presence online?
Yes, they can follow me on Twitter, Rick Allen Ross, and they'll see breaking stories about cults in my Twitter feed. Same thing with Facebook. They can find the institutional Facebook page for the Cult Education Institute. There's a YouTube channel. They can find that through culteducation.com. There's a message board, a public message board, very big one, attached to the Cult Education Institute that they can also find through culteducation.com. And then if they really want to dig in and drill into the subject of cults, they can read my book, Cults Inside Out, which is available in paperback. They can download it through Kindle on Amazon, or they can get the Audible version. And it's a very comprehensive book that not only has the history of modern cults, but really delves into what makes them tick, with over 1,000 research footnotes and an 18-page bibliography.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you very much for coming on and talking about all this.
Thank you, Michaela.